Welcome to Commander Central, episode 342, and today we're going to talk about playing games with people you don't know. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how you doing today, man?
It is bright and early on a freezing cold Sunday morning, but I'm doing okay.
It is miserable out. So when I left for the Commander Summit, and we'll talk about the summit here in a little bit, it was 71 or 72 in Minneapolis, and I got off the plane in Salt Lake City, and it was, I think, 28 degrees. So this cold, the cold front that's hit us here in Wisconsin was out west in Salt Lake City. So I flew into it, and then I returned home, and of course it was here. So yeah, that's it feels like winter, and I'm not a big fan of it at all.
Yeah, I'm glad we record inside.
Yes.
Like
Yeah, exactly. Chris isn't here today. We actually were supposed to have all three of us on Thursday when we recorded, and I had a work emergency, so we couldn't. And so it's just you and I going here today. And we'll actually throw this out up front too. Our recording schedule over the next 6-ish weeks is probably going to be erratic. There's enough things going on in everyone's lives that we probably aren't going to be able to record every week. Well, I guess we'll see what it looks like, but I don't think we have an exact schedule even about like what weeks we're going to be on, what weeks we're going to be off. So if there's just not a Monday show that you see, it's because of that.
Nothing's wrong. We just got to plan for the next few weeks.
Yes, so
holidays and personal stuff.
Yeah, so just heads up everybody out there. So we did get some events announced that are coming up in 2023. Hopefully even more will get announced in the foreseeable future. One of which is in Minneapolis, May 5th through the 7th, so early May. That's relevant because that's very close to Max and Chris and I.
It's like our backyard.
Yes,
almost.
very much so. So I'm going to be there, barring some crazy unforeseen circumstance. The same is true for Max. We'll try our best to get Chris over there for a day or two as well. So at the very least, the two of us will plan on being there. So yeah, if you are in the Midwest and thinking about going to the Magic Con, I think they're called now, that's scheduled in Minneapolis, we will be at that one in May. And then we'll talk about whether or not we want to do the Vegas one that got announced in September. That's also a possibility that we'll be at that one, and we'll see if anything else comes up next summer. And as soon as anything's announced and we decide, we'll let you all know what our plan is.
Well, Dana, you just got back, like you mentioned, from the Magic Summit out in Salt Lake City. Do you have any cool stories? Got to meet any cool people? Any fun games you played? Since this is where we normally talk about that. That's
a good question. I did. I had a really nice time. So this was 2 weeks after the big Magic 30 event in Las Vegas. So I was, number one, a little bit curious what attendance was going to be like. It was also put on by a group that hadn't done a Magic event before. This wasn't like an official WotC affiliated one, and it wasn't done by someone like Pastimes that has a history of doing events. This was Kingdom's first attempt at putting on an event, so I was curious how it would go. All in all, it was a really good experience. I don't want to sound like I'm equivocating too much there, because there were some issues, but the issues were almost exclusively with the tournament side of the event. They just had problems with like the software and some matchmaking issues, because that's where like all the chaos is, getting people queued up, getting them matched. That's a difficult thing to do, and that's where the problems were for the most part. And that didn't affect me. I wasn't playing in a 5K or anything. I was just playing on the commander side of the room, and that went quite smoothly. And there was a lot of people there too, probably more than I've seen for free play at any event I've been to, I would dare say. I mean, there were probably at some points on Saturday and Sunday afternoon, there were probably 1,000 people playing.
Wow.
Just Commander on that one side of the room. Just kind of free-for-all stuff. So that was really cool. And they haven't officially announced a second one for next year yet, but kind of the unofficial word was they're going to do it again. And I absolutely will go again. It was a good experience. For a first-time event, I don't think it was any more chaotic than the event I went to in Indy earlier this year, or even the Las Vegas one we went to in the Spring Max. And for a first-time event from a first-time group, I really enjoyed it. So I think the ceiling there is a lot higher than maybe it is on some of these other events. So I will definitely go back to the Summit when they do it again. So anyway, that's just kind of high level talking about the event as a whole. I played a ton of good games too. I played a ton with the pre-cons on Friday. There was an event called Creator Clash. They had requested that content creators participate in. So like you were given a pre-con and had to play against people with a pre-con. So I played, I think, 3 games with the Urza pre-con to start with. And they didn't have a ton of the Brothers War pre-con. So everyone else got like, a Crimson Vow pre-con or Neon Dynasty pre-con or whatever. The Urza deck felt like I was cheating, like 100%. It felt like I was like doing something wrong. Because that's the one, he's the 6 mana Esper commander, and makes a construct at the end of each turn, star, number of artifacts you control. I think I was able to get Urza out in turn 4 or 5, like in the very first game. I think turn 4 because of Mana Rocks. And he at the end of turn 4 made like an 8/8 construct because I had enough artifact lands and like just between the stuff I had played, just getting to turn 4, I was already dropping 8/8s. The deck was ridiculous. I had a ton of draw. It was really resilient. So yeah, I actually like by the second game, I was intentionally not playing some of the stuff I had just to like not feel like I was racing ahead of the other precons. And then I quit playing it. I think by the fourth game, I was like, I'm going to need to get a different precon because this one is just so much better than the other ones I was playing against. So I think I went and got a Shurikai one for the next game. And I cycled through a few different ones after that. But yeah, that Urza deck was bonkers. And then I heard the same thing from Matt Morgan at EDH Rec. He got the Mishra one, said the same thing. The Mishra one felt like he was cheating as well. So anyway, those two decks are really, really good if you're looking for them.
Awesome.
Games were excellent. I don't know if I had any bad experiences at all. There was one with Andy from Legendary Creature that was a bad game at the end, but it wasn't really anyone's fault. He had gotten the wand, I think it was Wand of Wonder, that was in the Baldur's Gate set. It's the red one where you can tap it to cast spells on the top of your opponent's libraries. And between that and like Blinkmoth Nexus, which untaps artifacts each turn, and something else, he was able to use it like 3 times a turn.
Oh no.
On everyone's turn. And he was just trying to find a way to win and couldn't. And none of us hit removal either. So this went on, like he activated it 20 times, I bet, before he was able to close the game out.
I mean, that's hilarious because you are dependent on what instance and sorcerers your opponents are running in their deck.
Well, literally, and it was, I can't remember what deck I was playing against him, but I looped through the deck. He went through because the cards go back on the bottom and the instants and sorceries that you can potentially play get exiled. So it got to the point where I had none left in my deck. Like he hit everyone he could hit. So yeah, it wasn't like the best play experience at that point, but what are you going to do about that, right? It was just a bad luck. No one hit removal. He had this interaction. What's he going to do? Not use it,
Right.
So that was like not super fun on anyone's part. Even he, I don't think really was having a good time with it, but I mean, whatever. Was just bad luck. That was really the only game. And again, that wasn't like it was anyone's fault that wasn't super fun. That was just terrible luck. I had a couple good things, interesting play experiences. I went to kill the table with Jury, and someone went to stifle the Jury effect, and I was able to, and actually in hindsight, someone pointed out it probably wouldn't have to work this way, but I had a Myriad Landscape I was able to crack, and then I bolt bended the stifle trigger onto the Myriad Landscape, so Jury went off and killed the table, and it was like, I felt pretty clever for doing that. In hindsight, I think someone pointed out that I probably didn't have to do it that way just because it says counter target spell or triggered ability. I think it was a disallow, but I can't recall what exactly the stifle effect was. I wouldn't have to redirect it onto the same effect. I thought I had to crack the Myriad Landscape so I could stifle that triggered ability because that's what Jury was. And I don't think it works that way. I could have just moved it to the bolt bend itself because it's like if I redirected a disenchant that someone shot at my artifact, I could still bolt bend it onto an enchantment. As long as it targets one of the legal things it can do, I don't have to match it up with what the person selected. But regardless, that felt pretty cool because I got a win out of that one. And then the last game of the last day, I was playing my Dramoka, the Eternal deck, and I was at 4 life. And they all commented too, you're going to talk about this game, aren't you? Because I was at 4 life and someone went to kill me with lethal, and someone had stolen one of my creatures, and I was able to homeward path the creature back to me, and then Swords to Plowshares it to gain
the 6 life.
To gain the life I needed to survive. And then on my turn, was able to play a creature, I think, with haste and true conviction to pop up to, like 20 life. And then a turn later, like I wound up ending that game at, I think, 100 plus life. So I went from 4 life and taking lethal to when I finally won, I was over 100, I believe.
That's dirty. I love
it. So yeah, that was pretty noteworthy too. But I think, like, again, every game I played there, and the vast majority, like sometimes I go to those events and you wind up, there's a lot of games you play with other content creators because like, oh, I haven't got a chance to fight this person in real life. And I played, I guess, plenty of those, but I played a ton of games with non-content creator people too. And I think every game was like everyone had a good Rule Zero talk, or at least if it didn't come up, it was because everyone's like, hey, I'm playing this. It's,
Kavu Tribal.
Yeah, right.
What are you going to do with Kavu Tribal?
Right, you could tell it wasn't going to be an issue. People are just getting better at that, I think, in general. So the games were all really good. Everyone had a good attitude. It was just the people were also a great experience there as well.
That's awesome. I'm glad you had a great
time. I did,
time.
yeah. So I will. In Salt Lake City is gorgeous. I mean, we didn't get a chance to do much like in town stuff because like by the time we got there, went out to dinner on Thursday night and then like just played all day Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then had breakfast Monday and left. It was not that different from
a normal Magic Fest.
Yeah, particularly because like you and I mean, I think some people go to those, again, talking content creators, and they do a lot more social stuff. They're like hanging out with one another and going places. And we tend to play just a ton of games. Like we go and we're there when the place opens and we're there till it closes. I think that when the last Vegas one before COVID hit, we were there playing games until they threw us out Sunday night. And then, us and the guys from Brothers from Commander Social went out and got food afterwards because, we were basically the last ones there.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I played a ton of games and I think every single one of them was a good time. So awesome. Yeah, great weekend. Okay, so let's kind of get into this show. And I'm not sure how long of a topic this is going to be because since events are starting back up again, and I just got back from one, we wanted to talk a little bit about playing with people you don't know, playing in public, talk about experiences with playing with new players. This is kind of a wide open topic. So I'll start with you, Max. Like, have you had any not great experiences lately you wanted to talk about?
No, but I think the few times I do go to the LGS, we tend to get slotted with the new player.
Sure, yes.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we tend to be the players that the store staff sends our way just because we're probably going to have a good game experience for that brand new player, which is nice.
Sure.
I think the one downside to that, though, is that it makes it kind of hindering what we can or shouldn't play
Absolutely,
out of our
sure.
deck lineup, which isn't a huge deal. If I really want to play that really thought-provoking game where I'm playing Brago and you're playing something that like Reki versus two other higher power decks, we can get that game in, but it's something that you aren't going to do with the new player that's been playing EDH for 2 or 3 weeks.
Right. Yeah, it's tricky. I'm trying to think how to phrase this. So power is super subjective in the best of circumstances. But one of the problems, particularly for someone who's invested in the game as you and I, and by invested, I don't mean like financially, although that's probably partially some of it as well, but like invested as in how much time we spend playing and talking and thinking about Magic, really changes a lot of that math. I have plenty of decks where, because we had lunch yesterday with a friend of ours, and we were talking about a buddy of ours who plays a Gonti deck. And we were joking about how like he never targets me for the most part because the cards I tend to run in my decks are not useful for anyone else outside of the deck I'm playing. But part of the reason that's the case is because I tend to build decks that are so synergistic, where the specific cards I'm running just are almost always handpicked specifically to work in that deck. So that also warps the power level. Like you can take this collection of cards that one person's running, and they on their own will look more powerful than this other collection of cards. But the second collection of cards that looks weaker, when they work together, make for a stronger deck. That's a difficult thing, I think, for power evaluation, to look at a deck and be like, this deck is... Because I think the reality is a lot of my decks are stronger than they look because of the amount of synergy I have baked in, because of the way I've built those decks. That also makes it difficult to throw those things too. Like I'll play against a new player and I'm like, oh, this deck's definitely going to be safe because it's just got a bunch of garbage cards in it. I'll use my Jaheira and Agent Iron Throne deck that's a relatively new one that's running just every terrible Eldrazi ever printed. Not even like none of them have Annihilator. It's all the ones that when they come into play bring in a 1/1 Eldrazi spawn or whatever. It's got like a dozen of those in the deck that no one plays because they're bad. But in that particular deck, where like Jaheira lets me tap all those Eldrazi tokens for mana, and then I can sacrifice them for mana, and Agent Iron Throne makes them do damage when they get sacrificed, they work really, really well in the context of that deck. And that makes it tricky. Like, okay, that you would think that would be a good deck to bust out against a new player, but the reality is it probably isn't. It's much stronger than most of what they're playing, and because the cards tend to be pretty obscure, they have no idea how to interact with it or deal with it. So yeah, no, absolutely. So that becomes a tricky thing to deal with for new players as well, and it's tough for an established player sometimes, I think, to evaluate how strong their decks might actually be, particularly when they're playing against a new player. The one specific example I wanted to throw out there, and I think when it happened last spring, we might have talked about it on the show, after I had gotten my first COVID booster, and I guess this wasn't even last spring. Was this the spring before? It was. COVID's messed up my sense of time.
I think everybody's. But so sometime between 2019 and 2021.
When we first got boosted and I first started going back to the shop, like literally one of the first games I played against, the guy tutored up and won with I think it was a Chain of Smog combo that had just came out in Strixhaven. So I guess that would have been 2 years ago. And I had some warning signs going in. He was a guy that like wouldn't show us what his commander was to start with. He didn't want to have a Rule Zero conversation. So I was a little bit hesitant to start with. And then after he tutored up the combo and won on turn 3, I very politely said, hey, just a heads up, you're supposed to give people a warning if we're playing at a power level where you're going to be running tutors to go get your combo on turn 3. We can match that power level probably, but you need to give everyone the heads up. That's what you're doing. And he was not at all receptive to that conversation. Outright hostile, matter of fact. And I was very careful. It wasn't even like, because you can word that badly.
Yes.
And I didn't. I was very cautious about it. So I just avoided that guy in the shop. I'm like, I'm just not going to play with him again then. He just wasn't open to that. And a couple of the guys that worked there, including Chris, is like, yeah, no, he doesn't ever want to hear that. He's just a jerk, and that's just what it is. Well, at some point then in the intervening year and a half-ish, he had been talked to enough times, or enough people had quit playing with him for that kind of behavior, that he then asked Chris in particular, and then a couple other guys working in the shop, hey, what can I do differently? So a couple weeks ago, when I went in, he flagged me down and asked if I would play and said, I'm sorry, I realized what I did. And actually, he kind of didn't. He was still like, you got mad because I tutored up a combo, and I had to explain to him, like, I wasn't mad that you did that. I was mad that because I said I wasn't even mad. I was annoyed. I got annoyed at you when you didn't want to hear the feedback that you should give folks the heads up. Oh, okay, all right. So then we played a game, and he was much better. He was making an attempt to match power. He was revealing his commander. So anyway, the point I wanted to make was people can change that behavior. He was a new player to commander. He did tell me he had some bad experiences at his last LGS where if he would let people know what his commander was, they would metagame against him, that kind of thing. Like, okay, well, that's fair. So anyway, there's a situation I wanted to touch on briefly, like, that guy did, after 18 months at least, adjust how he was handling those pregame conversations and how he was playing. So people can come around.
Dana, that's a great thing to mention, that, people do change. And that's great to see, and I'm glad the experience was better the second time around with that player. It made me remember way back in the day, this would have been when we first started playing Commander. At whatever shop we were playing at, there was a player who would come in and play EDH with us, and he had one deck that was actually made of legit cards, and then he had a completely proxied sliver deck, which was to the T exactly what you wanted to play that combo sliver deck, and kind of the same thing. He didn't understand why people didn't want to play against him when he was playing this perfectly tuned deck. He knew every line type of thing, and this is way before Rule Zero. Our pregame conversations really took place. It was more like, hey, I'm playing this. Good luck. What really irked me about him is, he listened and was like, well, then what can I play one of your decks? And that person then would turn around and be like, well, why are you running this card? Why are you running this card? Why are you running this card? Right. And it's like, okay, if you're going to be asked to borrow someone's deck, don't sit there and criticize it while you're playing it. Sure. Maybe say, hey, I have suggestions. Can we talk after the game?
Sure. Yeah.
Because, hey, I can't see what's in their hand, so who knows what they're talking about. And at first it was like, is he just trying to be funny? And it's like, nope, he's just seriously questioning every single card in the deck.
He's just kind of a jerk. Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally a good rule of thumb to not offer people feedback on their deck unless they solicit it first. You're just very rarely ever going to go wrong by just not saying anything, And if people ask, by all means, give them feedback. I still tend to be very cautious in the feedback I offer. But, don't, I would say, generally speaking, that's a lesson I've learned over the years. Unless someone asks you specifically about what they can fix or what they can add or what they can do, don't do it that way. And definitely be cautious when you do it. Try to, be gentle and be productive versus, he was never productive about it either. It was always like, what is this piece of crap card doing on your deck? And, to a degree, I do think there's an element of truth to the way he phrased things, because we probably all were running some bad cards in our decks back then that should have been in the decks.
Diabolic Tutor was a great card back in 2012, sure. Okay?
Yeah. I think we've all done that thing, and this is something, because I think what we're going to transition a little bit here, talking about things that new players do and should do differently. I specifically remember back in the day, when we were first playing Commander, you would crack some cool new mythic, and that's just a really good card. I'm going to put it in this deck, even if it didn't necessarily do anything useful in the deck that you were playing. And that's a thing I do think I see sometimes from newer players in particular, where like they crack that new, green mythic that has 9 lines of text on it and trample. And it's probably a great card in standard and just a great card in general in a vacuum. But if it doesn't push forward your deck's particular game plan, it might be a way worse card than some random uncommon that does tie into what your deck is doing. But that's like the kind of thing that I think new players almost never recognize right away. They don't see the utility of the quote-unquote worst card that works better in their deck compared to the splashy mythic that doesn't interact with what they're doing at all. A good example, I noticed this because I had played my Arden and Essior deck at the summit against, I can't remember who it was, and in a kicked off relatively quickly. And the card that wound up like finishing the person off or finishing somebody off was Inquisitor's Flail, which is an artifact or equipment from the first Innistrad block that doubles the damage a creature deals, but it doubles the damage they take too. But what's great about Inquisitor's Flail in an equipment deck is it stacks with things like
Double Strike,
like Fire Shrieker. So like if you have 2 pieces of double strike equipment, they don't do you any good necessarily. They don't stack on top of one another. You can put on another creature, I guess, but in my particular equipment deck, I just put everything on one creature. Whereas Inquisitor's Flail is going to double that damage, right? It's gonna even if I have that Fire Shrieker out or have a way to give stuff double strike, it's going to still work. So that was what I finished the person off with, and then I moved to another pod and played with 3 other people, and somebody was playing with a Boros equipment deck in the next game, and then afterwards they were like, oh, you want to look through my list? And so I just flipped through the deck quick, and looking at all their cards, they had all, I think, is there 8 swords now? Sort of, color and color. I think there's 8 of them now, and they had all 8 of those swords in the deck. And I remember like noticing whichever one is it, I think it's Light and Shadow that brings a creature back from your graveyard.
Yes.
Light and Shadow was one of the ones in the deck, but the deck also only had like 8 creatures in it or something. And that was, I didn't comment on that. I was like, oh, nice deck. That's all I said. I didn't like make a comment to the person at all about it. But like that was an example I remember thinking, particularly because I had just played that Inquisitor's Flail in the previous game. That was a sword that probably wasn't going to do them a whole lot of good in that particular deck. The things it did just weren't synergistic with what that deck was doing necessarily, which is why I don't run it in my Arden and Essior deck. I don't have enough creatures in that deck either. So that's not one of the ones I run. But it's a mythic sort of X and Y, so it's in that deck, right? Like the person sees that and like, oh, I'm building an equipment deck, I want every one of those swords in it. They'd have been better off with that Inquisitor's Flail, which is an uncommon that costs 22 cents, but they got that cool mythic, they wanted that cool mythic in the deck, and if you're having fun, I guess it doesn't matter. I'm not saying you shouldn't run cards that you enjoy. If you want to, if you are going for the achievement unlocked of having all 8 swords equipped to your creature, then cool. I mean, I totally get why those are fun. But that sword is probably worse more often than not in that deck than Inquisitor's Flail would have been. So that's a thing I think I see newer players do, where they kind of get the shininess of the mythic symbol kind of distracts them from what might be a better card in their particular deck that is less splashy and cool looking.
Yeah, I remember that back in the day. I mean, I did the same thing. Cool, I cracked this awesome Planeswalker. Let's put it in this deck that, I had at the time. And, I didn't think about this till you just started talking about it. But dang, that must have gotten actually maybe worse, since there's 9,000 versions of every card now. So It's like, ooh, I cracked the foil version, but now I cracked the, the Strixhaven, the Mystical Archive version of a Teferi's Protection, so let's go get that one instead. And granted, I used a very good card there in that example, but you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, oh, I cracked the big frame version of, this new Planeswalker from Brothers War. Let's put that in this deck, because it does do some of the artifacts, but maybe not anything better than, Baby Karn does.
Yeah, I got the new Transformer card I cracked in my new Brothers War pack. Oh, that's a cool flip card. I want to try that out. It's a mythic. Yeah, that kind of stuff absolutely is something that I think a new players kind of get roped into, for sure. Are there any other ones, Max, that jump out at you that you want to quick throw out there?
I think one thing I've noticed is new players tend to they like to make changes quickly.
Sure.
That's how I'm going to phrase that. So, they build a deck, they've played it 5 times, let's say. Oh, well, I never saw that card, or this card really didn't perform like I wanted to. Well, you've only played the deck 5 times.
Right.
Maybe that card will work better if you had 2 other cards out with it. Or just because, we'll use Chris as an example, just because you've never seen your Soul Ring doesn't mean you should cut it from your deck.
Yes.
There's 99 cards, and if, as a new player, I mean, to this day, I probably still don't put enough draw in my decks, so there's a very good chance.
Yeah.
I think working on the basics of deck building before changing the deck you built is maybe a better idea than just, I haven't seen this card in 5 games, let's put in something else.
Absolutely. Yeah. In Shoot, even I struggle with that sometimes where I'm like, I've not seen this card yet, I'm going to yank it out of my deck. I'm like, well, I haven't seen it yet. Doesn't mean it's not good. I just haven't seen it yet, right?
Right. And it also, this again kind of plays back into product fatigue where, when you get a new set every 3 weeks, by the time you put the cards from set A in, set B is out and set C previews have already started. And at that point, with how nitpicky and meticulous you are with your edits, Dana, I could totally be like, well, this card came out 2 sets ago, I haven't seen it yet, I might as well try the card that came out 1 set ago and see if that shows up more, versus cutting a card that, plays well all the time.
And the more decks you build, the less likely you are to see them because you have less, you're playing more different decks versus like when we first started, we were playing, when we both had like 2 decks or 3 decks, you play the deck every single week, and that's not how it happens anymore when you have, in my case, I think I'm up to 14 decks.
Gee.
Yeah, it's too many. And that's with taking a couple apart this year too.
I mean, I have like 8 if you count the 40k decks since I haven't torn those apart yet.
Okay, that's true.
They're in sleeves still. They're still sleeved up.
Those were super fun to play, weren't they?
Yeah.
So another one that really registered to me because I remember putting these cards in the decks is when I was playing with the precons at the summit. I don't remember which one of the ones it was, but 2 different times I found myself holding a blue sorcery speed X draw spell. I don't remember which one it was, but it was like, the blue X draw X cards, whatever it is at sorcery speed. And I remember early on in the first couple commander decks I built with blue, I'm like, oh, I want to put these in the deck because like just imagine that on like turn 9 or something, drawing 7 cards off. That'll be super useful when I'm out of gas and I can refill my full grip. Those are fantastic. They're not though, and I remember thinking that, and the reason it registered with me is because I had drawn one of them in whatever precon I was playing, and I was like, there's no situation right now where I want to tap out on this turn or at least come close to tapping out to draw up 6 cards or 7 cards or something and then not be able to play any of them till next turn. That always felt really bad to me or felt really bad every time I had those cards in my hand. I remember back in the early days of Commander putting multiples of those in my blue deck. So anyway, the point I'm making here is I think new players also tend to think in terms of the best case scenario. Oh, I have this X draw spell in my deck. I'm going to get at this point in the game when I have nothing else to do, and I'm going to spend 9 mana and draw 7 cards and have a full grip and no one else has anything, and I'm going to then proceed to, close out the game. Well, that can conceivably happen, but that's ignoring the fact that like you don't get to do anything till the following turn, which is a lot of time for your opponents to respond when they just saw you draw 7 cards. And those cards are genuinely bad the first 6 or 8 turns of the game, maybe not 8, say the first 4 to 6 turns of the game, when you've only got access to six mana. So like if it costs 3 to cast and 3 to draw, you're spending it's a 6 mana draw 3. That's a terrible rate of return. Those cards are really only good when you can like go hard and tap out and sink 8 mana or so into them. And I'm not saying those aren't playable. I understand that there's a lot of decks that have the ability to make infinite mana or whatever. So like there's definite uses for those cards, but I think in terms of like new players just running them as a draw effects, I think those kind of cards and just effects in general, I think new players tend to get really big eyes regarding, the best case scenario for this particular card. And I think that's generally the wrong way to look at most things. I think you want to look at the consistency of a card. Is it good on turn 2? Is it good on turn 6? Is it good on turn 10? Not every card is, and I run plenty of cards that are only good in niche situations, but you want to avoid having too many of those in your deck, I think, and that's something the new players miss out on.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think from my point of view, what cards like that jump out to me are like ramp spells, like, don't get me wrong, Kadama's Reach, Cultivate, 3 Visits, they're all great on turn 2 and 3 and 4, but on turn 12, when you have probably most of your lands out or only have 20 cards in your library, do you really want to spend a turn digging out 2 more lands when you should be finding a way to win the game.
Yeah, actually, like, I love land ramp and green. I run it in my green decks. I run those Farseeks and those Kadama's Reaches and those kind of things. But I don't run any more of those land ramp effects in green than I do Mana Rocks in non-green decks.
Mm-hmm.
And I do see those sometimes green players talking about, like, oh, I've got 15 ramp sources in my deck, and you're exactly right. I don't want that many, at least the way I play, because I don't want to be drawing that many of those on turn 8 or turn 9. Landfall decks are different, of course. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying you can over ramp. Absolutely, you can ramp more than you have ability to play the cards with the mana, and that's something I totally agree to watch out for. Don't get greedy with those kind of effects either, and think you're going to like race 20 lands ahead of everybody else, because then there's a good chance you don't have enough things to use all that mana on.
For sure.
Yeah. I do think that's also one of the reasons I've moved a little bit away from, because I can remember once upon a time having explosive vegetation kind of cards in my green decks as well. 4 mana ramp 2 lands, it feels pretty good, but I don't. Not only is it more efficient to cast the Nature's Lore Rampant Growth 2 mana for 1 land kind of effects, at least for me, I tend to not want to spend, like, spending 4 mana on turn 9 to ramp 2 lands feels like it takes up a huge chunk of my turn, so I just don't cast it and I do something else, so those cards become dead. Whereas spending 2 mana to cast a Nature's Lore on turn 9 or something feels like it still allows me to do enough other things in that turn that I'm willing to do it. And some of that's probably just like what feels right and what doesn't. But for me, spending 4 mana on turn 8 or turn 9 to ramp doesn't feel good. That feels like I'm sucking up half of my available mana and using up half of my turn. Whereas if I am willing to do a Nature's Lore on that same turn, I'm only using up 1/4 of my mana. So I feel like there's a lot more room to do the thing that I want to do. And there's no non-subjective way to measure that and say, don't run this. But like, definitely for me, the efficient green land ramp feels a lot better at every stage of the game than even the Sky Shroud Claim kind of effects. I just don't want to see those on turn 9, whereas, I don't want to see Nature's Lore either, but it doesn't feel nearly as bad to see it and use it than it does a 4 mana ramp spell.
Yeah.
So any other specific things you think you see new players do wrong or they should work on in their deck brewing?
Ask for help.
Yeah. Well, right. Like, we kind of touched on like how don't give advice unless someone asks for it, but you should ask for it.
Right. And don't go asking every single person in your LGS.
For sure.
Ask the people you have been playing with for the evening, or ask your friends that got you into the game.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're the ones who know probably what you like to play or how you like to play, and they're the best ones to say, okay, if you like playing aggro decks, well, let's see if you want to play like goblins or something, or let's make a deck that's more your style.
Yeah.
And hopefully your LGS staff has people that can do that as well. I know ours does. We're very lucky. We have a great LGS, and the staff is always there to help. I've seen other stores where that's not the case, so I understand we are very fortunate in that regard.
Absolutely. And the advice doesn't even have to be specific. It doesn't have to be like, what specific cards can I add? It can just be like high level. Hey, what does this deck generally need more of? Do I have enough ramp? Do I have enough draw? And to the last question, probably not. You probably don't have enough draw. That's definitely one thing I think most people, new players, but I think a lot, even sometimes in franchise players, just don't draw enough cards. So talking about that Urza's Precon, there's a card in there called Thopter Shop. It's a 3 mana. Whenever 1 or more artifact creatures you control dies, you draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn, and then you can spend 2 and a white to create a 1/1 colorless Thopter creature token with flying, so that's a tap ability. That card was absolutely bonkers in that Urza deck. And not even just like, at one point I got a Skull Clamp out and used it, and then everyone's like, nope, you can't have that. And they removed the Skull Clamp because, hey, that's a draw 3 off a Skull Clamp. But even without the Skull Clamp, even just like chump blocking with random stuff, someone swings at me and like, I'm going to block with this thing and then I'll draw a card off that. And I would dare say the one time I had Thopter Shop out, I probably drew 10 cards off it. And that's backbreaking for a 3-mana artifact that also makes you Thopters.
In a precon.
In a precon especially, yeah. Now, that card's probably less powerful in a normal environment. It is a 3-mana draw, but I still think it's a pretty good card, and your ability to run even more efficient draw effects than that in your decks, that's just what changes the course of the game.
Yeah, that's insane. On the topic of like what to ask, I think you hit it on the head. Like, what does the tech type do? Or ask about, like, what happened in a game is what I always did when I started playing. It's like, so why did everybody blow up that skull clamp? Like, why was it going to be a problem if you maybe don't understand, because you're new to the game?
Right, right. Not even your effects. Like, right, that third party played a skull clamp. Why did everyone, like, freak out? It's just an artifact that gives a creature +1, -1.
Yeah. I guess I have one more maybe tip of, advice more than anything is take notes. Like, there's the mental notes, but, like, bring a notebook. Bring a small notebook and just be like, hey, I played this game. We Dana for sure used to track the games he played, but I tried doing that, but it was more of a, this is how I lost, or this is what went wrong, because if it is game 25 or 30 with that deck you built, maybe it is now time to be like, oh, consistently, this card has never really performed like I want. There's your kind of evidence to say, now let's replace it.
Yeah.
That might be too much for some new players, and I totally understand that, but when you feel comfortable, that helped me a lot. Especially like during coming back to play after COVID, when I hadn't played for so long, it was nice to be like, oh yeah, that's why this card is in the deck, or this is why this card should come out.
Or yes, that is a great point, and the specific iteration of that I would bring up is not only pay attention to things that get destroyed that someone else has or that work that you have. If you see someone else play a card that you haven't seen before that's really, really effective, do not be afraid to be like, oh, what is that? I'm going to take a picture of that card or whatever. Like, write it down, whatever is the easiest way for you to make a note. I've absolutely seen cards before where someone plays that I either didn't know or I just knew, but like never really registered to me how effective the card was. And I'll just take a picture on my phone just as a reminder for myself, like, revisit this card next week and see if it'll work in one of your decks. Because man, that card was a bomb. And top of my head, I can't even think of any specific examples recently, but I've 100% done that before, where there's like a card you've forgotten about or it just didn't register to you how good it was going to be until you saw someone play it and you're like, oh, I absolutely need to put that in one of my decks now.
Yeah, that's a great idea too.
All right, well, so that was a little bit chaotic of a show. I've used the word chaotic a couple times this episode even to talk about Commander Fest, but we just had a couple random things we want to talk about and get them out there. So hopefully that'll be a little bit useful to people out there playing with new players or playing in the wild. If you have any tips or hints for us you want to throw our way, feel free to let us know. I'm also going to quick shout out. We had a couple Commander Central people I saw at the summit. In particular, I played a couple games with Carlos, who goes by CDM in the Slack. So Carlos, good to see you, bud. And I think also we're going to do another event in Chicago this spring. I want to say in March, Max.
Yes. That
Seb is putting on, and we'll actually, once we get a few more things ironed out, we'll announce something at the top of an episode too for people that are in the area and want to go to that. So we did like a little private get together last year, and we're gonna do another one this year.
Woohoo!
All right, good deal. Okay, that is gonna wrap up this episode of Commander Central. I'm Dana. You can find me on Twitter, as long as Twitter's up, at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max, and you can find Chris at YSquishy1. Thank you to Rafael Garcia for editing our show. You can find them on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker, and our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. Until next week, I am Dana.
And I'm Max.